Shame is at the core of avoidant attachment. It is what drives much, if not most, of avoidant behavior. Shame is a toxic emotion, and it's often confused with guilt. Guilt, well, that can actually be a healthy emotion. Because first of all, if you're feeling guilty, that means you have a conscience. And that's your brain's way of telling you, I did something wrong. But guilt actually can have a potential resolution. If you feel guilty, you could make amends if you hurt somebody. You can stop repeating the behavior that you feel guilty about. But whereas guilt is, I did something wrong, shame is, I am something wrong. My very existence is wrong. I am broken. I am defective. I am inherently unlovable. And that wound is at the core of avoidance. And it stems from consistent childhood emotional neglect. Regardless of whether you're dealing with a dismissive or a fearful avoidant, this is a person that received some form of neglect. Emotionally, their emotional needs were not met. The thing is, they personalize that neglect, growing up to feel like there's something wrong with them, that they are inherently defective, not lovable. It's the core wound of shame, and it is a toxic emotion. But what avoidants learn to do is to avoid that wound of shame. Nobody ever showed them how to process emotions. Nobody ever showed them how to cope and deal with life stresses. They learned to stuff it, put on a happy face. Their feelings weren't welcome in their household. So they never had any process to deal with this. So they learned to avoid things that are unpleasant to them. Just stuff it, avoid it, run from it. Stick your head in the sand like an ostrich. And that includes that core wound of shame. And that shame drives their behavior. That shame is why they put up walls around their heart. Because their fear, their subconscious fear, and some are consciously aware of this fear, is that if I let down my walls and I let my partner into my heart, my partner is going to figure out that I'm defective, that I'm unlovable, that I'm worthless, and they're going to reject and abandon me. But if I keep them at an emotional distance, I get to keep my walls up, which means I don't get exposed for being not good enough and not lovable. And I won't get rejected, I won't get abandoned. That's why it feels so unsafe for them to have emotional intimacy, because they risk exposure, at least in their subconscious mind. That's what they fear, being exposed as not being good enough. Also, that core wound of shame is why they struggle with expectations. They often grew up in households where they're only given validation and approval based off of meeting expectations. Parents or caretakers that had very high expectations on them. So they struggle to meet their parents' expectations. So it's inevitable that they won't meet your expectations either, even if your expectations are very reasonable. So if they can't meet your expectations, they're ultimately going to disappoint you, and they will be exposed as not being good enough. So they seek to create emotional distance to avoid that core wound of shame. And that wound of shame is also why they avoid accountability and avoid self-reflection. Self-reflection is a requirement for emotional growth. You can't grow without it. You have to process emotions, not suppress them. And you have to take accountability, recognize your mistakes, and learn to do better. I did this wrong. This is how I can do better. That's the healthy process for growth. But the avoidant, they don't do that, because in their mind, taking accountability, acknowledging wrongdoing would be confirming their own inner shame, their own inner defectiveness. In their mind, it's, I did this wrong because I'm defective, because I'm not lovable, because I'm worthless. It's too painful. They've learned to avoid things that are painful. So what they do is they look to external things to blame their behaviors and blame their fears on, so it doesn't become their fault. Because if it's not their fault, they don't have to poke at that core wound of shame. They get to avoid it. So when they shut down and deactivate, instead of saying, ooh, this is my insecurities, this is something within me, no, it becomes their partner's fault. Or work is too busy. We're just incompatible. Something externally. That way they get to avoid confronting that core wound of shame. They don't have to deal with it. That's why they're very defensive if they get criticism, even if it's constructive criticism, because criticism in their mind confirms their own core wound of shame. They did something wrong, you're criticizing them, well, it must be because they're defective, worthless, and unlovable in their mind. So the reason they avoid things in general is because of that core wound of shame. And that's also why they seek external validation, surface level, but validation. Because when they're getting validated, they're being told that, oh, look, you are good enough, you are great, and it helps numb that core wound of shame. It gives them that dopamine, the reward chemical that goes off in the brain, and helps them feel good, at least in the moment. So avoidant behavior in general is all shame driven. It's all driven by a low self-esteem. Yes, this person can appear to be charismatic and competent, especially in the workplace or with friends. But it's really just a mask because they're not vulnerable with any of these people. They have their walls up. It feels safe. And they learn to really get their value, their self-worth through accomplishment. Again, due to those expectations that were put on them. But the real reveal is how they show up in a relationship. This is a person that is deeply insecure, fears emotional intimacy, fears commitment because they also associate that with rejection and abandonment. It is all shame-driven behavior, and shame is a toxic emotion that is counterproductive and self-sabotaging. Yes, they can change, they can heal, but they have to want it badly enough to actually confront that core wound of shame and work towards healing it and commit and follow through with new behavioral patterns. If they want it badly enough, they can do it, but it's going to require them to actually take accountability, which means confronting that wound, which is something that they've programmed themselves for their entire lives to avoid. But they absolutely can do it, but it's up to the individual. If they don't want it, if they want to keep avoiding that core wound of shame and continue the self-destructive behavior in relationships, they can do it. That's up to them. But recognize their behavior is not a reflection of you not being good enough. This is a person that doesn't feel good enough to be in a relationship with a loving, consistent partner because of that wound of shame.